I'm joined once again by Jen Briney, who's host of the Congressional Dish podcast, which exposes corporate influence in the bills and laws passed by Congress. Jen, there were two cybersecurity bills, so-called cybersecurity bills, in the last couple of months, which did not get the attention that some other cybersecurity bills received and probably should have gotten more attention. Let's talk about both of them. You tell me which makes sense to talk about first.
Well, I think the one that makes the most sense to talk about first is HR 1731, because the text of this bill is actually included in both of them. And what this bill does is it adds private entities to the list of groups that will be part of the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security. And what this center apparently does is it coordinates information sharing between the federal government and any other entities, which will now include businesses. And the things that had me concerned about this particular bill is that it wants to automate, so automatically have information be shared from private businesses that volunteer our information to the government. And it would give these private businesses, any kind of private business, it says private entity, it's incredibly broad. It would give them immunity for sharing our information with the government. And then the most important part of this, I think, is that there's nothing in here guaranteeing any kind of privacy protections. In fact, it says that the person that's going to write the privacy protections is the Undersecretary for Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection in the Department of Homeland Security, which when I tried to research who this person is, that position doesn't exist. It's not actually the Department of Homeland Security.
So talk a little bit about what immunity means in this case. Like, give us a scenario under which if this immunity clause were not there, here's what could happen. And as a result of the immunity clause, here's how it would go.
Well, the way I would imagine this happening, because, I'm not a lawyer, but what I do imagine could happen is, let's say your apartment building or your bank, or for any reason, any private company wants to send information to the government. Well, you would not be able to sue that company for sharing your information, even if it breaks the contract that you signed. So I recently just moved into a new apartment building. And so if this giant apartment complex, which has units all over the world, started sharing my information, even though in my contract it says in certain places in my lease that there's information that will not be shared without my permission, having immunity means that they can just ignore that part of the contract because they don't have to worry about a lawsuit from me. And that goes for banks and restaurants and all other kind of private businesses. There's no restrictions on which businesses would get immunity with this.
And in researching this, I found that there seemed to be quite a bit of agreement from those all over the political spectrum that when it comes to sharing data about online threats, for example, that companies should probably be legally protected in those cases, even if it goes against a contract that may have been signed or an understanding privacy policy, whatever, because we would sort of consider these threats to maybe be extenuating circumstances in some way. The problem seems to come, though, that the definition of what a threat is or whether a piece of information is directly connected to the safety or security of individuals or customers of clients, it's very subjective in nature.
It's subjective and very broad. To just say that it has to be some kind of cyber threat. Well, cyber means internet. So it's some kind of threat that goes over the internet. It's very, very broad. And then the other part of it, so that was the first bill. The second bill then takes it a step further and says that the information can be used by the government to do all kinds of things, including investigate, prosecute, prevent, disrupt, and do all other sorry, I just got confused. It can prevent, investigate, disrupt, or prosecute all kinds of different crimes. They listed murder, manslaughter, assault, sexual abuse, kidnapping, robbery, carjacking, extortion, firearms use. This one's concerning firearms possession. So they can try to prevent you from having a gun based on what it says in this law. And it also can be used to combat theft of trade secrets. So we're not talking about information that's just going to prevent some kind of cyber attack. When I think of a cyber attack that could cause damage, it's something like a cyber attack that would open the gates of a dam, and let a bunch of water through and drown a town. That's the type of thing that we're thinking of when it's like, all right, do what you need to do to prevent that. But to prevent theft of trade secrets and to prevent crimes, that opens the doors to all kinds of misuse, especially when you consider that the second bill opens up an office in the Director of National Intelligence Office, James Clapper's office, who's not exactly trustworthy. And so the intelligence community would have access to this data too. So the punishments are just not in here for misusing the data. There's no actually rules for what the data can not be used for. And the list of things it can be used for, it's going to be used to investigate domestic crime. There's really no way around it.
Yeah, the prevent and disrupt are completely red flags in my mind. And when you combine that with the fact that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Bankers Associations, and other industry groups were all about having these protections, it's sort of the typical players. And I was interested when you mentioned the protection of intellectual property, because when we talk about TPP, and we talk about the impact that TPP would have on strengthening the ability to protect intellectual property for companies, this is following that same pro-corporate vibe of TPP.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the immunity is just so important here because it says that the program is voluntary. And in the episode that I had where I talked about this, the April bills episode, I had a couple clips from the congressmen that were saying that the entire point of these bills is to make it in the best interest of the companies to share information with the government. And so it's voluntary for the heads of these companies to decide whether or not they want to share. Who it's not voluntary for is us. And that's what I'm concerned about. So you can sign a contract that says anything, but they don't actually have to pay attention to those contracts because immunity, it says they can't be sued. That's a huge, huge problem. And another huge problem is that both of these bills passed by huge majorities. The first one that doesn't list all of those things that the data can be used for. But the first bill passed 355 to 63, so that had plenty of Democratic support. And then the second bill, the one that really creeped me out, passed 307 to 116 with about 200 Republicans voting for it and 100 Democrats. And there's no veto threat on either of these.
Right. And in an attempt to sort of be nuanced analysts of politics, we always make an effort to say, okay, here's a whole bunch of issues on which Democrats and Republicans are very, very different, and there are very different ramifications to electing one versus the other. And on the other side, we can simultaneously be aware of areas in which Democrats and Republicans are by and large unanimous and in agreement on. And typically, correct me if I'm wrong in your estimation, Jen, typically those areas relate to money in politics in one way or another. When it comes to maintaining this sort of corporatist status quo, that's where I'm seeing more sort of unification between the two parties.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When it comes to doing favors for like the banks, and then this is giving immunity to all private companies, like, yeah, these two parties work together for sure. Where they differ is stuff on, like during the whole fast track debate, the biggest battle when it came to fast track was not fast track itself, it was trade adjustment assistance. So it would be giving money to the people that lose their jobs because of our trade policies. And that was something that the Democrats wanted and the Republicans didn't. So that was a very clear ideological divide. Something like this, something about cybersecurity. I mean, when it comes to the Defense Department and just surveillance of the public, these two parties are just entirely too close. There really isn't any pushback from within the Congress on these types of policies, with the exception of a few individuals. But there's no party that's fighting against this.
So a couple sort of caveats to what was passed that maybe would make us think it's not quite as bad, but maybe that's actually not true. One is an amendment was approved so that this legislation would expire in 7 years. I mean, I guess on the one hand, it's great that it has some expiration. On the other hand, it's very likely that within the next 7 years, something new will override this anyway.
Or they just continue it. It's exactly what happened with the Patriot Act. I mean, they just named it something different and privatized it with the USA Freedom Act, but all of this stuff is still happening. So it's much easier to get something into law and keep it there than it is to take something away, because what you get is the congressmen getting up on the floor and they have all of these different reasons why we have to have this or we're all going to die. And then they just get it continued. So it's very easy to get this stuff just renewed over and over again because they just create a crisis situation. If they have one example of a cyber attack doing anything thing provable, then they'll use that as justification. So it's very important to make sure this stuff doesn't become law in the first place.
And then lastly, the companies, in order to have the legal protections outlined, need to go through what are described as reasonable efforts to remove names, email addresses, or other personal information. As we know, if you have really good lawyers, you can argue that you made a reasonable effort, and that's not going to really be a protection, I don't think.
I don't think it will either, especially because there's no punishments in here if they don't take reasonable efforts.
No question about it. All right, we've been speaking with Jen Briney. Check out the Congressional Dish podcast. Jen, great as always to have you on.
It was great to talk to you again. Thank you.